it's the perfect red. Hello sketching friends, welcome back to another video. Today I am going to be ranking every single Daniel Smith paint that I own, from my least favourite to my most favourite, and I got a lot of Daniel Smith watercolour paints, so we've got quite a lot to get through. Obviously all of these are just all my own opinion from my own use of these paints. I don't have every single paint in the Daniel Smith collection, but these are just the ranking of all the paints that I own. So let's start off with the very worst and we'll gradually progress to the positive. So starting off we have Pyrrole Orange. I bought this one on a whim when I was in an art supply store with my friend, and they didn't even have the full size of it, which actually turned out to be a good thing because I just really don't like this paint. It's too bright and almost acidically orange, so there's not many instances where you'd actually want to use it. The only thing I can think of is if you were doing a traffic cone or something like that. I also tried to mix it in with some sunset paintings before, but usually it just looks a little bit fake, so I'm just not a big fan of that. So next up we have Phthalo Blue. Phthalos are a bit of a divisive paint colour because they are very, very staining and they're very punchy, so they just punch into everything that you're painting and can really alter your mixes quite dramatically, even if you just put a tiny bit of it in. So for that reason they're very, very hard to mix with, and for me personally I've just barely ever really reached for this. I feel like if you're going to pick a blue, I wouldn't pick Phthalo Blue to start off with. The next one is Buff Titanium, which is actually not transparent, so it's a little bit opaque, meaning when you put it down over existing paint it will cover it up slightly. The reason I bought this was for doing skin tones, but I actually don't paint portraits hardly ever, so personally for me I just don't get much use out of this. If I'm going to go for something opaque then I'll just mix in a bit of gouache. The next one is Lavender. Now this is a really, really pretty colour on its own. My issue with it is it's just not very useful in a palette because you can't really mix it with anything, and when you do you just don't really see the colour because it is a very weak colour. I know that Joseph Zabukvich, who is one of my favourite watercolour artists, uses lavender in his paintings, so maybe I'm just not subtle enough for this paint. It's still a really nice colour, I just don't find myself reaching for it very often. Next one is another phthalo. This time it is Phthalo Green in blue shade. This one again has all the same issues with the blue phthalo. It's very staining and it just overtakes a mix very, very quickly. The reason it's a little bit higher up than the blue phthalo is because it mixes really nicely with another colour that I have, which is Pyrrole Scarlet, which we'll come into a bit later. It creates a really interesting grey colour. Another thing I really enjoy it for is painting greens in the sea. It is very, very useful for that, especially when you want to get that really deep sea colour. My next colour is Moon Glow, and it's definitely got the nicest name of all the paints in my list. Again, I just don't use it very much because it is very specific. It is a mixture of 3 different pigments. It's a green, a blue and a red all mixed together, which is a very interesting mix. I had this for quite a long time, but I just barely find myself reaching for it. I've heard that it actually is a little bit fugitive, which means that it fades over time. You can definitely Google it if you're interested in finding out more about the light fastness of this paint. So the next one on my list is Sap Green. And I do like this shade of green. It is quite a nice natural shade of green. My issue is I just don't like mixing greens that much. I prefer to just mix my own greens with some of the colours we'll get to in a little bit. It is very handy for when I'm going out urban sketching, but in general it's just not really one that I reach for that often. The next paint on my list is Wisteria. This is quite a similar paint to the lavender one which I showed you earlier, but this one is a little bit higher on my list, mainly because I've just been going out and painting a lot of jacaranda trees recently, which are a tree here in Sydney that everyone just goes mad for when it turns into spring. And this is just the perfect colour for painting jacarandas. It's not really a reason to buy a paint, especially if you don't live somewhere that has lots of jacarandas, but if you like this kind of shade and maybe you do a lot of trees or flowers, it is a really nice paint. Next is Nico as a yellow. I bought this one just because I wanted a yellow that would be handy in lots of different situations, and in a way it is. I just don't actually like the colour that much. It's almost a bit mustardy. And I just find that some of the other yellows that I have in my collection I reach for more. So this one doesn't really have much of a logical reason because it is actually quite a good paint. I just personally would pick a different yellow, especially if I was just starting my collection. Sorry to nickel as a yellow. The next colour is Carmine. And I will say to poor old Carmine that you are alright, that's why he's sort of in the middle. But there's just a colour that I prefer to use, which is very similar to this one. So yeah, there's nothing wrong with this. I just wouldn't say it's one that I reach for a lot. Carmine, you're alright, you're just not my fave. And the next one is quinacridone Burnt Orange, which is a really, really pretty colour, and I really enjoy using it in certain situations, which is why it's slap bang in the middle. There's nothing really wrong with it, I just don't reach for it that much. I think because it's an orange, which you can mix with other colours, and I find it kind of hard to mix. It doesn't always do exactly what you expect it to do when you're mixing it with other colours. So I don't know whether that's just because I haven't taken the time to properly understand this paint, but for me personally, I just don't intuitively mix well with it. Next one is quinacridone Gold. Believe that this is almost a fake version of quinacridone Gold because the pigment that they originally used in quinacridone Gold has now run out or been discontinued or something. Nevertheless, I've never really tried the original quinacridone Gold, so this is the only one I really have to go off. And I do really like it, it's lovely. It's a nice gold colour. It's just not one of the ones that I reach for all the time. So we're moving on to some of the slightly more favourite-y side of the list. Yellow ochre is a really nice earth tone. It is a yellow, but it's almost yellowy brown, so you can use it in a lot of situations. Sand, buildings, there are lots of different ways that you can use this. It's also really handy for skin tones. I definitely would recommend this as not the first yellow you get, but if you're looking for a yellowy earth tone, this is one of my favourites, and as you can see, I have nearly used up the whole packet, so I need to buy another one soon. Next one is Neutral Tint. This is a very unique colour. It's almost a grey, but it definitely is a bit more interesting than just a pure black or pure grey. The reason I like it is because when I mix it with the next colour in my list, which is Burnt Umber, these two together just create a very, very dark colour. And with all the paints in my collection, this is pretty much as dark as I can get when I mix these two together. Also just love Neutral Tint for when I don't want to use a pen, but I just want to get something black, like a street sign or just something that I want to paint in black. Sometimes you just don't want to mix a black, and that's when I reach for the Neutral Tint. And then Burnt Umber, which is next to it, is quite a dark brown earth tone. It's just a very, very handy colour. I would definitely recommend this if you're looking for a dark earth tone. Next up, and you can see these paints are getting progressively more mangled because they're actually ones that I use a lot, and this is Pyrrol's Scarlet, which is a very perfect red, I would say. If you picture red, the primary colour red, this is probably what you would picture. For using on its own, if you need something red, it's the perfect red. I feel like a beauty YouTuber talking about lipstick, but that is how I feel about this colour. And as I said earlier, if you're looking for an interesting grey, try this out. Next up is New Gamboge, which is a very, very warm yellow. It is very warm, very nice for sunsets. I just love it. It just works so well for lots of different things. It also mixes really nicely with lots of other colours, and it's just a really good paint. I just love this one. Next up is Cobalt Blue. Cobalt Blue is a really, really nice blue. It's not quite as dark as Ultramarine Blue, so it's kind of a middle, I kind of think of it as a middle of the road type blue. Like it just has your back, you know? It's just very handy. The next thing is quite surprising, to be honest, because when I bought it, I wasn't expecting to love it as much as I do, and that is Carbazole Violet. It's a very deep purple. You only need a tiny bit, otherwise it would just be so purple. It can be quite overpowering, but kind of in a good way compared to the phthalos, which is just overpowering in a bad way. I feel like this is really in your face, but in a good way. I also love pairing it with New Gamboge. These two colours, I think because they're opposite on the colour wheel, they're just so good together. Whenever I use both of these in the painting, it just is very, very harmonious and just lovely. Hello, so I'm just editing this video and I just realised that I completely forgot to mention quinacridone rose, which is actually really high up on my list. It's a really, really good mixing colour. It's kind of a pinky rose. Kind of think of it like magenta, like in the printers with the cyan, magenta and yellow colours. It's a really bright colour. It's really, really good for mixing purples. And I just use it a lot, so it's pretty high up on my list. It's also one of the first colours that I ever bought, but somehow I just completely forgot it. So this just missed out on the top 3 podium, but I love it. I use it basically every painting that has a sky. It is the perfect sky colour. If you've just got a sunny blue sky day, this is the only paint that you need. So now we're on to the final 3, and number 3 is Hansa Yellow Medium. You can see how much I've used this. I think this is the second tube, and I think I've got another one that I've just bought. So this yellow is the best yellow for mixing greens. I believe it's a slightly cool yellow, but it is quite neutral because it is that medium shade. So it just kind of works with everything. It's just really, really good. And my second paint might seem boring to pick a brown for my second favourite paint, but again, as you can see, I just use it all the time, and that is Burnt Sienna. And this is my most used earth tone colour because I love to mix it with, let's talk about the number 1 while we're here, Ultramarine Blue. It is just the best blue of all time. You could do a whole painting with just these 2 paints. So these 2 are very well known for mixing perfectly together to create a grey. So that is kind of why I put them in the top 2 spots. Burnt Sienna is just a really lovely brown, and then Ultramarine Blue, the number 1, it's a dark deep blue. It's very granulating. It's quite a warm blue, which means it leans slightly towards the purpley side. This colour pretty much mixes with, I'm looking down at all my paints, I would say that it would mix with most of them. It's just the most used paint that I have. And wow, my throat is sore from talking about all of these paints. If you're wondering why all my paints have these little clips on them, then click this video here and you can see me building my art studio complete with DIY paint holder.